Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the September 2021 Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the how-tos and whys of nonprofit IT staff training. Today, we're going to discuss the business needs for IT training, some examples of training done well, various training methods and resources you can use to develop a training program for your organization, and some tips and tricks that will help you get started with training at your nonprofit. My name is Johan Hammerstrom. Let me advance to the introduction slide. I'm the CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this webinar series. I'll also be a co-presenter for today's discussion on training. The slides and recording for today's webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel later this week. If you're watching on YouTube right now, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel to receive automatic updates when we post new webinar recordings. Please use the Q&A panel throughout the webinar today, and we'll do our best to respond. We really want these webinar sessions to be interactive. Now, before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of 38 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and we've been consistently named a top 501 managed services provider by Channel Futures, and it's an honor that we received again in 2021. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's co-presenter, David Deal. David Deal is the founder and original owner of Community IT before selling the company to the employees. He's the current chair of the Community IT board. And at least, I don't know if anybody else, if Dave realizes this, but I consider him to be the lifetime CEO emeritus of Community IT. David
Well,
Deal
Johan,
is...
I'll just say that's another word I think for CEO 1.0, and I highly recommend the 2.0 upgrade.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. David Deal is also a founding partner of Build Consulting, an information strategy firm that works with nonprofit organizations. So welcome, David. It's hard to believe that in the 20 plus years that we've known each other, I think amazingly, this is the first time that we've actually co-presented a webinar together.
That's kind of crazy. Somehow you've avoided it or I've avoided it all of these years, but here we are. The stars have aligned, I suppose.
We couldn't avoid it any longer. So Dave, could you tell us a little bit more about Build Consulting and your role at Build?
Sure thing. As one of the founding partners at Build, there were four of us who had careers in the nonprofit technology space. And we really wanted to work with nonprofits on technology strategy specifically. So Build is heavily invested in the nonprofit space. We exclusively work with nonprofits, generally mid-sized and large nonprofits across the US and Canada. Our engagements are strategic. We help our clients make strategic technology decisions, from comprehensive technology roadmaps to software selections of systems like CRM, ERP, digital engagement, program management, grant management, and more. And our approach is really a collaborative approach. It's not about us choosing technology for you, it's about empowering you to make good technology decisions and to effectively do the things that support good adoption, strong adoption of the technology tools that you choose.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And I think that's a good lead into today's topic. You know, adopting technology tools is an essential part to implementing technology to IT itself. And training plays an important role in technology adoption. So that's what we're going to talk about today. There's four main topics that we're going to be discussing. The first is talking about training needs. What are some of the business needs that lead to organizations requiring training for their staff, or thinking about training their staff? What does it look like to do training well? I think training maybe is something that hopefully many of you are here today because you understand the need for training, but training, it can be somewhat elusive, IT training in particular. So we're going to talk about that, some examples of where we've seen training done well. We're going to spend some time talking about different methods. There's no one size fits all or single approach to training. So we want to talk about some of the different methods that can be used for training and where different methods are appropriate. And finally, some training resources that we've found helpful and that we think you'll find helpful as you think about a training program at your own organization. So that's the agenda today. I'm looking forward to it. Um, let's get started talking about training needs. Sometimes implementing new technology feels like jumping off a cliff into the unknown. Um, what are how have you seen the need for training? Like, what are some situations where you've found that organizations, start to think about needing training?
Well, I think sometimes it starts with implementation of a new piece of software, a business system that people need to learn how to use. I think other times it's staff feedback where staff say they don't feel particularly well trained on a piece of software, um, or they provide feedback on the training program. I'll often hear organizations when they ask their staff will identify training as one of the areas that could use more attention. So it seems like it's often short of what staff would like, but somewhat paradoxically, it seems like organizations can develop some trainings and then staff don't always show up, don't necessarily prioritize it. So sometimes it feels like a New Year's resolution to go to the gym, right? And maybe they'll do it for a little bit, but it's fairly rare in my experience to see a long-term sustainable training program that's put in place that is successfully managed and executed. Uh, I'm curious when it may come up for some of the nonprofits that community IT works with.
Yeah, it's a similar situation. I think training is something that people in general realize that they need in kind of in a vague way, sort of in a vague sense, like we should really have more training. There's sort of a general sense that staff could be more effective or productive in using the technology that they have. Oftentimes, I think it's motivated by frustration. People want to do something, feel like they should be able to do something with the technology tools that they have, but just get frustrated that they can't. And so I think the pain maybe or the symptoms become readily apparent. But then I think it is hard to connect that to a solution. How do we go about addressing those issues? What are the things we can do specifically through training? I think there's a general sense that training is valuable, but a lot of people don't know where to go from there. So I think one of the things that would be helpful is one of the things that we want to do is look at on a more specific level, like what are some of the specific areas where training can be valuable. And I was wondering, Dave, if you could talk a little bit about specific business systems where you've seen. I know a lot of these systems are systems that Build works with.
hmm
What are some of the areas where you've seen people, more specific needs for training?
Yeah, I think so. These are some of the systems that Build works with our clients to implement. Usually, we're involved in the assessment to figure out do they need new software, then the software selection process, and then sometimes we're involved in the implementation in a guidance and support role. And in being involved in these implementations, the need for training inevitably comes up. We'll talk a little bit later in the webinar about some specific um, instances, some specific types of training that are useful in different scenarios. But there's certainly that training that staff need when you're implementing one of these systems anew. And then there's also, the ongoing training that new staff need when they come in the organization, or training that people need as processes change, as the way that you're using these systems change.
Yeah, so specific training for specific business systems can sometimes be easy to recognize, or is prompt. It sounds like it's prompted by specific events, that affect one or more teams in the organization.
It is, and I think business system training upon implementation of a new system is the easiest training to, like, everyone gets it, including the organization leadership. They get that, okay, people are going to need training. So in some ways, this is the easiest training to convince an organization that they need. Some more difficult trainings are kind of that ongoing training. What does it look like as we bring new staff on, as we continue to train existing staff? Um, and I think, so it's a little bit of a harder case to make for those trainings. And one of the examples of training programs that are like that is really cybersecurity.
Mm. And I did want to thank you for that segue. I did want to throw you a little bit of a curveball because a thought just occurred to me. We didn't discuss this ahead of time, but what about in cases where a business system was implemented, but there was no training done? So,
Mm.
maybe it's a year or two later, they got off on the wrong foot, they made a bad first impression with this system. Is it a lost cause? Like, can you go back and do the training, after the fact?
It's staff morale and staff sentiment towards the system is extremely important. Like, you can have the best technology, but if people had a really poor experience of the implementation, then you're fighting an uphill battle. I'm not going to say it never works to try to re-implement or uh, kind of retrain people in that system. I think the way I would approach it is, hey, there's some process improvement going on here. And as part of that process improvement, you look at how to use the system more effectively, and then you launch it from that perspective. Hey, it's process changes, um, and that gives you a reason to also figure out how to use the software more effectively. It's not just kind of focused on retraining on the same thing that failed before, I guess.
Yeah, I like that approach, and you're presenting it as a positive rather than as a, well, we know we messed up, we know that there's a lot of pain, we're going to take the pain away. Instead, you're framing it as, how can we get better? How can we get to a positive place with this system? Um, and that's very much the approach that we like to take with cybersecurity. Actually,
Hmm.
we've found that sort of fear-based and pain-based motivation around cybersecurity is rarely effective over a long period of time. And to do cybersecurity well really requires an ongoing long-term commitment by the organization. So we also like to sort of emphasize cybersecurity as a positive. Here's how you can protect your organization, the mission that you're working to accomplish. Here's some things that'll really safeguard your organization and the work that you're doing. So cybersecurity, I think, is finally something that's on most people's minds. I know um, we read weekly of hacks and breaches. There was some very high profile cybersecurity incidents earlier this year, the pipeline hacking, for example. So I think people are starting to become very aware of cybersecurity, and in general, most nonprofit leaders understand that cybersecurity is an issue that needs to be addressed. We're actually starting to see it more and more with cyber liability insurance, where that's an area that has undergone kind of a revolution over the last 2 or 3 years. And my understanding is that in 2020, um, claims exceeded premiums. Basically, for cyber liability insurance policies, the companies had to pay out more than they were taking in, and it's kind of a wake up call for the industry. And we've actually seen this year many of the organizations that we work with, they're now having to attest all kinds of cyber security protections, multi-factor authentication, logging. They have to verify that they have these things in place, and if they don't, in some cases, the premiums are 10 times more expensive. In other cases, they're not getting coverage at all. So we're starting to see a lot of pressure from external parties like insurance companies to really push for cybersecurity. And we like to think of that the main protection against cybersecurity incidents is what we call the human firewall. So oftentimes organizations will think, well, I need to buy a lot of fancy, expensive technology to protect myself. When in reality, the best protection is training staff, developing and nurturing a security culture within the organization, and then training staff on good security processes. Um, so, like I mentioned, multi-factor authentication is a protection that is starting to become a requirement for a lot of organizations. And generally speaking, it's important to do training around multi-factor, just to kind of explain the concept, how it works, and then you can also do specific training around how to use it. But that's an area where uh, there's a need, and the need can be leveraged to deliver a training that can then be broadened in scope. The premise can be multi-factor authentication, but you can start to touch on other cybersecurity training issues, and pivot into more of a sort of general security training. And then there's also specific cybersecurity training with these fake phishing campaigns, which we'll come back to that because we have a specific example we want to share on an organization that used that to great effect.
Well, I like how you framed cybersecurity training as a positive, not a fear-based approach. I'll definitely have to add that to my toolkit. I like that a lot, and I agree. Whatever organizations have been doing for cybersecurity, it's not enough, and it's just. I think there's an education effort underway that cybersecurity is not just something that the IT team looks after. It's something that's everyone's responsibility.
Yeah. And then you can also, and probably should, do some training around basic productivity. And I think this can be an interesting area because your staff may be at a kind of a wide range of abilities. Some staff may not need training in many of these areas, but I think we found that many staff do. Email, even though it's a solution that people are familiar with, we've all been using email for 20, 25 years. Most organizations are either using Outlook with Office 365 as their email solution, or they're using Gmail as part of Google Workspaces. And don't underestimate the difficulties of going from one to the other. And we've supported plenty of nonprofit staff who came from a Gmail background, and it took them a while to sort of figure out how to use Outlook, and vice versa. They have sort of different paradigms for how they manage email. So um, just some basic training in that area could be really helpful. We really saw over the course of the pandemic, and I think we all, all of us recognize this, the rise in real-time collaboration tools like Teams, Microsoft Teams, or Slack, as well as video communication tools like Teams as well, or Zoom. And everyone sort of figured out how to make it work, but that doesn't mean that people are using it to its full potential. There's a lot you can do in Teams, or in Slack for that matter, that you and your staff may not be aware of, or certainly your staff may not be aware of. So even though these solutions have been out there for a while, there may be a business need to provide additional training on them. And I think now would be a great time. You can sort of pitch it as, look, we all had to jump in, feet first into the deep end at the start of the pandemic to start using these tools. And now that we've survived, how can we kind of take it to the next level? And that might be a great opportunity to look at doing some more specific training for staff. Yeah.
I think I'll just add, Johan, I think as I look at these technologies, a lot of these lend themselves to off the shelf content that vendors, that training providers have pre recorded. And the challenge in those situations isn't generating the content, it's running a training program to make sure the right people are getting the right training at the right time. The other thing that strikes me about this is some of these technologies do require organization specific training, and nonprofits do need to take ownership for that part of it. So for example, how an organization is going to use Microsoft Teams or Slack in their environment, when do they use those as compared to email? What types of conversations should people be having there? Those are things that are specific to an organization, and that's part of training as well,
Mm.
not just kind of learning, here are the bells and whistles of this software.
I think that that's a fantastic point. That guidance and curation are really essential, maybe even more so than content creation. And I know I've run into that problem myself. At one point we were looking at Teams, using Teams as our telephony solution. We'd make and receive all of our phone calls, and I just wanted to kind of see how it worked. And so I went to YouTube. I figured, there's got to be plenty of this content online. I went to YouTube. It took me forever to find a video that actually had what I was looking for. It was a lot of vendor demos. It was a lot of hour long, poor quality how to's from, random YouTubers. And it really kind of, I thought of that as you were sharing just now, because if you tell your staff, oh, there's plenty of content online, go find it, they're going to spend an hour looking for content that is not going to necessarily meet the need. So I think for the organization to take ownership over what the training program should look like is probably, and that may actually be more, feel more approachable. Well, here are the things we need to train on, and here are the ways, that we feel like that training can be effective. Um, and then once you've got that outlined, maybe all the content is already actually available
Hmm.
to use. So great. So that kind of leads us into some examples that we wanted to share of organizations that have done training well. And I think these examples will highlight that point we were just making about the need to think of training not as content, but actually as a program, as a process and a program. So Dave, do you want to share a little bit about this organization you worked with that relied on LinkedIn Learning?
Yeah, happy to. And a couple of organizations come to mind that utilize this, but of course, LinkedIn Learning used to be known as lynda.com. Um, and the way that we use that at the organizations was to think about, first of all, different levels of digital literacy of staff, and then to develop lists of courses and content that was appropriate for those different levels. So we tried to think about levels of digital literacy, who used what software and which jobs. And then LinkedIn Learning was a great way to provide pre-recorded content that we simply had to curate. What was the right content for the right people. Um, and that organization, one of the organizations, set an expectation that they wanted staff to complete 1 hour a month of training. And then HR would track it, and the executive director would get reports on it. And honestly, what made that work, number one, some staff had interest in doing this, not all staff. But number two, that reporting happened, and the executive director showed an interest in it. And it was discussed with people if they weren't doing the training program. So, nothing says this is important like leadership paying attention to it. So that program, we ran that for about a year, and the purpose was just to increase the general digital literacy of staff in different positions with different software. So I think that worked pretty well. And the nice thing about that is it provides the content, and it provides the tools to monitor the use of that content as well. So you can easily see who's progressing through that program.
That's great. I think you can't overemphasize the importance of executives and leadership support, of IT initiatives and training especially. I mean, I think we're all familiar with examples of leaders who don't participate in the training program and the silent signals, that sends to the rest of the organization about, how important or valuable it is. So it's a great example. We've I alluded to this earlier, but we've been able to use training on multi-factor authentication. So when we enable and set up multi-factor and single sign-on for our clients, um, we use the training as an opportunity to talk more broadly about cybersecurity in general. So, um, the organization and the staff who come to the training, they're coming for a specific training on how to use multi-factor authentication and the steps they have to go through to enroll in multi-factor. But then we're framing that how-to in a larger context, and that allows us to provide some additional training around security. Um, it's out of the scope of this webinar and some of the other webinars that we've done this year. One of the things we talk about in cybersecurity is knowing who your adversaries are, and that really developing a strong security posture and security mindset depends on you knowing who your adversaries are. So we've been able to use these multi-factor authentication trainings as an opportunity to get the staff at the organization to think about who's targeting your organization. Are they opposed to your mission and they're trying to harvest information? Are they cyber criminals and they're trying to steal money and resources from you? Who do you think is coming after you? And the organizations that have allowed us to kind of expand the scope of the training, we're able to kind of sneak in a broader cybersecurity training um, under the guise of a simple sort of multi-factor authentication training. But it helps to raise security awareness, which is also one of the things that you experienced at another client with your fake phishing campaigns.
Yes. Um, one client, well, a few clients have implemented Wombat, which was acquired by Proofpoint. So Proofpoint has a few tools that are helpful in staff training around cybersecurity. One of them is an assessment that can be assigned to staff to help you figure out where does staff need the training first of all. Secondly, they provide kind of a built-in learning management system where you can assign different videos to people either based on the results of that assessment or just as part of a training program where it's assigned to everyone or groups of staff. And then also, they support things like fake phishing attempts, where you can see who clicked on the link in the email, and it can immediately take them to a training video on why they shouldn't do that. So I found tools like that to be very helpful at clients. And then at one client that had been doing that for a while, we felt like we needed to uh, kind of shake it up a little bit, make sure we were keeping people's interests. So we worked with Joshua Pesce of Roundtable Technologies. Shout out to Joshua if he's listening today. Um, and brought him in, and he did a great sort of in-person session with all of the staff. There was some gamification involved, and that was a helpful way to kind of keep it fresh and present things from a different angle as a way to keep staff engaged in this topic.
Yeah, I think keeping it fresh, presenting things from a different angle is definitely getting staff excited for the training, coming into it with enthusiasm are all important. I think something that all of these examples have in common in terms of making training successful.
And I think you all at Community IT, Johan, have used some cybersecurity training programs other than Proofpoint, and I think you mentioned one or two of those when we were speaking earlier. Any of those you would recommend?
Yeah, we've used one called Know Before, which does a similar, provides a similar function as Wombat Proofpoint, in that you can set up ongoing campaigns and you can have them in increasing level of difficulty, so they can start off with very obvious emails that are just sort of obviously fake phishing campaigns, and then sort of ratchet up the sophistication so they start to appear more and more realistic. And you can kind of use that to measure your the readiness of staff, and then they also pair that with training videos. So if you uh, well, both, you can just set up a training program and have people kind of go through the program to watch videos. So it's kind of a pre-built LMS sort of functionality, which we'll talk about later. And then you can also, staff who click and who fail the test can be required to watch, a video, just kind of informing them as to, why they would have gotten phished if they had clicked on the link. So Know Before has been helpful. There's a few others like Fishline, I think, from Barracuda that provide similar functionality. There are some great partners. So if, as a nonprofit organization, you have access to some great nonprofit technology partner networks. Two that we wanted to highlight are N10, the Nonprofit Technology Network. Many of you are probably familiar with their annual conference, but they also have a variety of training courses throughout the year. They have webinars that help provide training on technology topics. They have courses. They also have they have a certification course that they've added as well. So N10 is a great resource, just n10.org. And then also TechSoup. Many of you are probably familiar with TechSoup because of their donation program, particularly Microsoft and Adobe products are available for nonprofit organizations at deep discounts on the TechSoup website. But they also have a pretty robust training, basically sort of online courses. They have multi-week courses that you can take. Some of those are geared towards technologists at the organization, and some of them are geared towards non-technology staff. So TechSoup is also a great resource, and we've partnered with them to offer. They offer a multi-week sort of cybersecurity training course. They had a 100 level. They've recently added a 200 level. So it's a good place to get more information about doing training. So let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about the approach to business system training. So
Mm.
this one, and this again goes back to that point that you made about needing to focus on process and program and being deliberate about training. So what are the steps that you would recommend organizations go through to do that for business systems?
So first and foremost, I think this will go much better when organizations and teams have thought in advance about how do we want this process to work? What is it that we want people to do? And the clearer an organization or a department lead, team lead is about that, the easier everything else is after that. So, for example, if you're implementing a CRM and you want to start to use it to track activities, how you're interacting with your constituents, well, one of the big questions that's going to come up is which of those activities are we going to track in the CRM? Absolutely everything, only meaningful emails and calls and meetings. And clarifying things like that in advance of a training are really important before showing people, taking the time to try to show people, here's how you record activities. It ensures that you're going to get quality, consistent data in to this system that you're implementing. So I really suggest start first with the process, clarifying it with SOPs, workflows, expectations for how it's going to work. Um, I think one of the other things I'll say about this is not just something for the IT team or the business systems team to do. It really is a shared responsibility, in my opinion, of the business systems team and the business units to ensure that new staff are trained on processes. I think IT and the business systems teams, they're really best situated to develop and deliver the more general training. Here's your introduction to this software and the breadth of things we do with it and how to do certain generic activities in the software. But really, the team members, the business unit team members, are the experts in their processes and how the tool is being used to support their process. So I think you really have to go to those subject matter experts in the processes to develop and deliver process specific training. So it's really a shared responsibility of IT and business systems with the business units. I think each organization has to get clear on who's going to do what, and then I think HR is the team that should typically be responsible for making sure that that's happening in the right way, making sure that as people come on board, introducing them to the IT and business systems team for their general orientation is important, and then making sure that the subject matter experts know when to lead with what they're doing. Um, I think just the last thing I'll say about business systems training, uh, really, if you think about it, the training, probably what comes to mind for most people is, hey, we're going through this implementation and we need to train people before it goes live. Yes, and that should happen really close to go live so that people can use what they're learning right away. I think that's an important point I'll talk about a little more later. But if you think about it, usually there's a design stage and a configuration and a testing stage where you're working with a smaller group of staff. And that's really an opportunity because that smaller group of staff usually need to be trained on the system before they're doing the user acceptance training, as it's called. Before they do the testing on the system, usually there's some training involved in that. And that's really an opportunity to work on your training content, your training delivery in preparation for the larger staff training just prior to go live. So that's how we approach it at Build. And Johan, any additional thoughts here?
I just wanted to say I love that suggestion, because you're really incorporating training throughout the process of implementation. And I think sometimes, I think too often, really, when we think about training, we think about that thing at the end, that necessary evil that comes at the very end or close to the very end of the process. And I think, your suggestion of let's put the training together for the people who are implementing, for the people who are involved in the migration process, for acceptance testing. Let's have training at every stage along the way. Then by kind of weaving it into the overall project at every level and at every phase, um, you're it's probably going to lead to a more effective and successful training program at the final stages of implementation.
And a better return on that big investment of new software.
Yeah. So what it means is you have to have a training mindset from the very beginning, I'm guessing.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't know if you're ready to transition to the next slide, but one of the
Sure.
tools
Yeah.
that we find helpful at Build Consulting for doing this is a stakeholder impact grid. And at its simplest, what this is something that cross references the teams in your organization or the groups. Think of those as the rows of the spreadsheet. And it cross references that with the processes that are changing, and the processes are the columns. And so you match up the groups, the rows and the columns, the groups and the processes to identify who's going to be impacted by changes in each of these processes when we implement new software. That's fundamentally what it's about. So you can plan that training, to your point, Johan, so you can know in advance here are the different groups we have to meet, uh, we have to provide training for as each of these processes go live. Um, the other thing that you can do is you can extend that. There's a tool that we have on the buildconsulting.com website. It's a change management impact template that builds on the stakeholder impact grid. And this really helps you to think through the resources and methods that are appropriate for each group. Was it high impact, medium impact, low impact on that group? Do they need in-person or asynchronous training? What job aids do they need? What communication should we be thinking about? What sort of leadership alignment considerations are there around this as well? So those are a couple of resources that are free for download: the stakeholder impact grid and the change management impact template that at Build we find helpful for planning out trainings related to business systems change.
That's great. I mean, those are great resources, and I think um, that's a great way to think about training and a great way to think about who needs training. And again, to like approach it from that standpoint of a process. Like training is not it's not an event. It's an ongoing process in the life of the organization. So we've talked a lot about how training can be successful and ways of thinking about training. Let's turn our attention to um, the types of training. What are some of the different methods? We sort of alluded to this earlier, but keeping in mind that the training is not just the method. There's all the planning and the process design that has to go in first. But once you've done that, then you're in a much better position to sort of identify which training methods are going to work well for which stakeholders and for which business processes. So, I'm sure you've experienced a fair amount of vendor training in your time. Uh, is vendor training useful? I mean, I guess, should vendors offer training? They often tout the training that they include with their software? How far should we go with what vendors are promising?
So I will definitely endorse it as useful, and I will also say that it is definitely not uh, the full picture, right? And what we're talking about here is when there's pre-recorded content. Sometimes it's live webinars, sometimes it's classroom training, and companies like Microsoft, Blackbaud, Salesforce, they do a great job providing a wealth of training materials and third-party training providers as well. And these can work well for kind of general digital literacy. There are lots of resources that are readily available, and none of us should reinvent the wheel when it comes to these things. How we'll often use this at Build with our clients is it's used as an introduction to software. And there are some types of software where this can get you 90% of the way there. If you want to learn about Word or Excel or Google Sheets or Google Docs or something like that, or Teams or Slack, then this training can get you 80, 90% of the way there. When it comes to implementations like CRM that are maybe a little bit more unique to each organization, some of the vendors will offer trainings that help you learn a CRM, but that training takes you much less of the way to where you need to be after the trainings. The training really skews toward here's what our software can do, and even when it's provided by someone who's helping you to implement that software, often that's still the case. They're looking at it through the lens of this is a technology tool that can do A, B, and C. And so I really think that's useful, and you need to follow it up with trainings that are really customized to your organization and how your organization is using it.
So let's talk about the customized trainings and when that's appropriate and when it's worth putting the time in to develop that.
So I think this sort of user-generated training content is what I would call it, and I would say this is needed for the more specific business systems training. Here's how we're going to use this system to do X at our organization, and this is really delivered best by a staff member or a consultant who has worked with your organization on the business process. So Build provides this type of training sometimes for like CRM implementations, for example, but whether it's a staff member or a consultant, someone who has been involved in how do we use this tool to support this process. Um, and if you have someone on staff who is great at that, I'm working with a client right now where that's the case. Um, People who are trained in professional development and trainings and things like that, so they have some great resources to rely on at a school that I'm working with. And if you have a staff member who can do this sort of thing, or many staff members, since it's going to be specific to different processes, then that's fantastic. And again, I'll just highlight it requires clarity from the organization, the department, on how the group of users are going to be using that system. That's an important piece to clarify first. It's not something that can just be handed off to the trainers. It's something that leadership needs to think about in advance of the training.
Mm, that's a great point. Yeah.
So it really is a collaborative effort on a number of levels, right? It's not just something to be delegated without thought.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great, maybe one of the key words, a word for the day, of this presentation is collaborate. And I think, earlier when you were talking about training not just being a responsibility of IT or business systems departments, but being also a collaborative responsibility with a specific program area or another business unit. That the thing that came to mind for me was breaking down the silos. Oftentimes we often hear about the silos that exist within an organization, and for training to be effective, it really requires a collective effort. Everybody has to feel involved and invested in it. And I think that if you do that work in advance, then maybe it helps to alleviate. I've certainly given trainings where the mood in the room is I'm being forced to come to this training that IT is doing. And most people, for better or for worse, like IT is the department you want them to be behind the scenes getting the job done. And so kind of creating goodwill and a sense of collaboration ahead of time also makes the training event, I think, more successful just from a a buy-in perspective.
Great points.
So in terms of you can do a show and tell training. That's kind of the classic. You go to a classroom, you're watching something. You're watching nowadays. I guess you're watching a video. Um, are there times where show and tell is useful? What are some of the limitations of show and tell training?
Yeah, and I think in looking at our time, I'll kind of skim through this quickly, but I think it's really just helpful as an introduction to something that's new, as a precursor to hands-on training. Because the challenge, show and tell is great for covering a lot of material quickly, especially for a group of people who may be at very different levels in their understanding of something. But it's really hard to retain unless you apply what you're learning. What's the rule of thumb? People take away about 5 minutes of content from a 1 hour training. So yeah, we hope you get 5 minutes of good content from today's webinar. But really, you remember it if you use it. And so I think the hands-on training is really key for anything after that initial introduction.
I will say we've now started to release these webinars as podcasts. So if you want to listen to them while you're developing the training program, as a that might be effective. Um, so it sounds like hands-on is a better. Uh, I think it's important to note, as you said, there are times in which show and tell is effective and can be used effectively, but it sounds like it needs to be used, in concert with a hands-on training approach.
Indeed, use it or lose it, basically. I mean, I had a Power BI training 6 months ago, and I wish I had opportunities to be hands-on with it since then, and I haven't. So, I wouldn't be starting from where I was before. I'd be a little bit advanced to that, but I haven't used it enough since then to really fully benefit from that training. So, use it or lose it. I think it really is. It's easier today with more staff having laptops to just have have a group show up in a room and then lead the training there. You don't have to worry so much about the logistics. How do we do a hands-on training? And that allows you to really tailor it to groups at different levels. Not everyone needs the same training. And so you can really think about how to break teams down into groups that are going to move at a similar pace. Because the challenge with hands-on training is how do you keep people moving at the same pace when they're all
Mm,
trying to do this stuff that we're showing them how to do.
yeah, and yeah, it's more time-consuming, more expensive. It requires more investment up front. It requires a work environment to work to do the hands-on work in. So there's definitely more involved. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about specific resources that organizations can use to put into place this training program. If you're incorporating training thinking into your implementation process, if you've put together your stakeholder impact grid and your change management impact template, you understand who's being affected. You've designed a effective training program and process with an appropriate mix of vendor training and customized training of show and tell training and hands-on training. You've got all of this in place. What are some of the tools that you can use to actually deliver this training that you've done such a great job designing?
So here's just a few ideas. Number one, videos are becoming more and more common. Especially short videos can be really helpful. We'll use it for 30-second to 1 minute kind of how-to snippets. Or the other time that we're using video is just like recording a Zoom or a Teams training session that's an hour that someone can attend. And the advantage is it's more descriptive. It's richer content. The cons, it's not as easily searchable. It's not easily editable. So if something changes about what you recorded, you essentially you could edit a part of the video, but more likely you're going to end up re-recording that video. Um, so how-to documents certainly have their place. They're easier to produce than videos, I would say. They're searchable, they're editable. The cons, it's not quite as easy to read something on a page and follow it in the same way you would if you're watching it on a video. And then, finally, I think there's software that kind of is available within the software that you're using. Salesforce is one that I'm familiar with. There's a software called WalkMe that was used that can be used with Salesforce to provide sort of just-in-time training, if you will, in digestible bits as you're using the system. And we had, one client, for example, who used it to support onboarding of a large number of light users, volunteers, chapter staff, into using a Salesforce application. This was 10,000 users, and not all of those could be reached with training at a particular time, a scheduled training session. So WalkMe became an aid for those volunteer users, for chapter-based staff, uh, to really help them learn how to do things like volunteer onboarding into the system, scheduling mentoring, guiding event managers on how to manage group events. And then there was a set of knowledge base articles. In this case, it was in Zendesk. And these KB articles and WalkMe really referred to each other to kind of make that a really rich, uh, you know, a rich set of training content for people who would learn in different ways. Um, so that was really helpful. Another thing that I found helpful is Screencast-O-Matic, and there are plenty of tools out here. I'm not saying this one is any better than the others, but it's one that I appreciate because I record short videos, it hosts them for me, and then I can take the links from that and really, embed those links in other places to get to those videos. So that's some of the stuff that I've found useful. Johan, any thoughts or things to add to that?
No, I think those sound like great resources. I think the lifespan of a training resource is something you definitely want to think about as you're putting it together. We have a pretty massive online documentation repository that we use for managing, you know, our clients' IT systems, and it's all text based. They're basically just extensive how to documents, and that works a lot better for us than a video would because it's changing. All of these networks are sort of living entities, or at least dynamic, and you need to be able to change those how tos on a pretty regular basis. So thinking about sort of the long term, you know, the lifespan of the resource of the content, I think is really important.
And I think you're about to share about one of the best resources of all.
Yes, your peers.
Yes.
Peers are an incredible resource, and I think we really try to encourage. We're obviously happy to answer questions around IT, but it's far more effective to have someone in the organization who knows how to use various IT solutions as sort of a first line of defense for a couple reasons. One, they're going to be a lot more available than an external party is. Two, they understand the culture of the organization, so in general, staff are going to feel more comfortable coming to somebody they know to get answers to questions. And three, they're familiar with the work that the organization is doing, so they just have a better context for the tasks, the activities that someone is trying to do. So having subject matter experts, someone who's sort of seen as an expert on a particular system or in a particular area, is really vital. I think we've seen over and over again that organizations who have a subject matter expert for their technology solution, universally, the whole organization uses that solution more effectively than in cases where the organization doesn't have someone who they're maybe not the owner. If it's a database, they're not necessarily the person who's responsible for keeping it clean or paying the bills or working out licensing, but there's someone who really understands how to use the system effectively, and they're sort of acknowledged and seen as an expert in the use of the system. So those are really effective. And then also having a formal mentor program can be helpful, especially for newer staff who are coming into the organization. A lot of this discussion that we've had about training um, applies to new systems that are being rolled out to existing staff. But you also want to think about taking all of these resources and this approach and think about how you're going to make it available to new staff. You're not just training the 5 staff that you have right now, you're training that new staff person. You're developing a training system for that new staff person who's going to join the organization a year from now. So mentoring programs just sort of formally saying this is your mentor, even for a short period of time, can be very effective. As can organizing the resources that you have.
Yeah, I think uh, if you're an organization that really doesn't have a training program and you're just starting to gather things, like the first level of maturity around a training program might just be getting together a list of links to videos, to helpful resources and descriptions of those, and putting them in one place so it's easier for staff to find. And we've used things like an intranet or a wiki before for things like this, especially if a lot of the content is written content. Then a wiki can be really useful for that. It's easily searchable. Or if you just have a list of links and descriptions of what's in the videos that those links are pointing to, that can be really helpful as well. Um, Sometimes these lists can be managed in the software. In Salesforce, for example, just having a page of links built into Salesforce that links to some of the videos has been a um, kind of a low cost way to go about something like that. And the advantages to this: it's easy to create, it's easy to update, it's easy to access. You can get more sophisticated as you go to greater levels of maturity around your program. There are LMSs where, here we call them pre-built. And what we mean by that is just LMSs where the content is provided, like LinkedIn Learning, where you're just picking and choosing different classes, courses per group, per person. And then there's a customized LMS where really you're getting a learning management system platform, and it enables you to produce your own content to embed into that platform. And some common tools for this: Cornerstone has been one of the market leaders. I'm working with a client right now that's using My Trailhead, not to be confused with Trailhead, which is what Salesforce uses to or provides as a training resource for Trailhead. But My Trailhead is a platform that organizations can use for their custom training content. There's software like Moodle, which is open source. And then also, I would point out, if you have an HR information system, a lot of HRIS systems come with an LMS. And I would encourage you to look at that. You may already have an LMS in house that you didn't know about. The advantages to an LMS, a learning management system: you can give assignments, you can track completion of those assignments. Oftentimes, they'll have content creation tools. The downside is, at that point, you're looking at an ongoing investment, a greater investment in the cost of these tools. So, really, whether it's right for you depends on the maturity of your training program and your commitment to it. Are you going to follow through on helping to make sure that the right people are taking the right trainings?
One other method of organizing resources, which I hadn't thought of, but one of the attendees just chatted in, and it's a great suggestion. For peer-based training in larger organizations, maintaining employee profiles that showcase employee proficiencies, expertise, that can also be really helpful. Having those employee profiles can give new employees, an idea of where to go if they're looking for peer-based training. So,
And I'll just add that HRIS software can be helpful with that, in terms of providing a structure to kind of plug some of that proficiencies and expertise into, and provide a ready-made system to do that. It certainly doesn't require a system like that, but can benefit from it.
great. So we had a slide for Q&A, but you have to keep in mind this is our first webinar after over 20 years of working together. So it's amazing we actually finished it within the hour. But
I don't know how we
unfortunately,
held it all in this long, Johan,
I
but
know.
yeah, great to be able to share.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today. I did want to mention that anyone who's interested can continue the conversation with Build Consulting. You can go to their website. I'll just chat this out. You can tweet at them. Is that the proper term?
It
Tweet
sounds right to me.
tweet to them, and you can reach out to them with this contact info. Also find them on LinkedIn. Um, just wanted to highlight next month, October, Cybersecurity Month. We have a lot of fun things planned. We have a quiz, sort of a self-assessment quiz that you can take to check your cyber awareness. So keep an eye out. We're going to be posting that on our website. We're also going to have a cybersecurity focused webinar for our webinar in October. Our webinars are free, open to the nonprofit community. It's going to be Wednesday, October 20th at 3 o'clock. It's a little bit of a surprise. It's going to be related to Cybersecurity Month. So we encourage you to register and join us next month. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your attention and your time. And thank you again, David, for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on with you, Johan.
All right, take care.